En gång om året. En gång i livet. Det ser ut att kunna vara lite bättre, va?
During a short period each year, the rivers in southern Sweden reveal what fishing used to be like before the effects of dams, fertilizer runoff, acidity and drainage programs changed things. Just as spring turns to summer, our largest mayflies hatch, and for a few days, maybe a week, the biggest fish come up to the surface to feast on this abundance. For fly fishermen, this is a fantastic but crazy period. An all too brief period when dreams of the biggest fish in the river can come true.
The period when Ephemera Danica and Ephemera Vulgata hatch is known in England as Duffer's Fortnight, because during this period of perhaps 2 weeks, even the worst fisherman can catch a big fish. This is a little exaggerated, but the chances are better than at any other time of the year.
Ja!
For years now, we've traveled around the rivers of southern Sweden at this special time, looking for the almost mythical giant trout. Join Johan and myself for a few days fishing spread over 3 seasons and a few rivers. Witness our success and failure, happiness and dejection. We can offer you cold weather, winds, low water, just about anything you can imagine. But we also have some really fantastic days. So, hopefully we can show you a bit of Danica fishing, give you a few laughs, or even inspire you to go out there and try for yourself.
Planning ahead of the mayfly season is an important part of fishing. As well as time flies, we usually take out the maps to decide which waters would be fun to try out.
We always revisit some of our favorite waters, and for various reasons. It might be a beautiful river, the fish are perhaps bigger, or the hatch is more intense. There are a lot of things that make a river a favorite one.
Each season, we make an effort to try out 1 or 2 new waters. We might have got a tip about a river with Danica or a river with trout where there ought to be Danica.
The biggest worry is being able to get the time just right. If you miss the hatch, you can spend a whole day on a river without seeing a fish. Get the day just right and you can be amazed.
You never know from year to year how the Danica hatching will be. Weather, water levels and a lot of other factors have an influence. But no matter what the state of the fishing, it's a fantastic feeling to be out looking at the big mayflies.
There are long periods between the rises. A lot of this time is spent scouting, waiting and discussing different theories about why they hatch or don't.
The fish are there along with the mayflies, but the changeable weather makes it hard to find fish that's constantly feeding. The wind in particular is a problem. There's a lot of waiting.
We talk a lot about what the fishing might have been like in southern Sweden before the marvelous stocks of wild trout were wiped out by dams, acidity, excessive use of fertilizers, and not at least overfishing.
Even the best waters we fish in are a pale shadow of what they could be. Today, low water in summer, water used for irrigation and drainage ditches from the forest, all are everyday but serious threats. The increased pressure to expand existing dams and build new for mini power stations is a growing dark cloud over our rivers. We all need to get involved in fishery conservation and other areas if our waters are to have a chance.
Despite the serious tone in our conversation, it's hard to see many dark clouds in this weather. This is the first real opportunity of the year to catch a Danica trout. We move off along the river again. Somewhere, something will happen. We find a fish that's feeding sporadically, sometimes not showing itself for 15 minutes. In the end, Johan can't wait and gets into position to see if he can reach the fish.
From the start, I had a feeling this fish wouldn't take, but this early in the season, it's always a relief to be able to cast a fly and get those first drifts and shake off the dusts of winter.
Despite presenting the fly well, the fish is shy and we give up. There are plenty of long stretches left where we can look for feeding fish, and we might get lucky in spite of the cold and fairly windy weather.
In the end we find some fish in a wooded stretch, and it's Ulf's turn to try. The fish are feeding sporadically, just like the others, and the gusts of wind make it hard to place the fly where we want it.
After a few attempts with upstream casts, it's time to change position and tactics. The trees and bushes will make it difficult to cast, that's true, but on the other hand there's not much risk of scaring the fish.
It's quite obvious that Ulf really wants this fish. He has changed flies several times already, makes a few drifts over the fish and changes again.
I can't get much of a cast in among the trees and bushes, and at first it's difficult to get the drifts working without drag, but after a while I finally calmed myself down enough to present the fly properly. The fly drifts down to where the fish are, but after so many casts without a reaction, we don't have great hopes.
Ja! Jesus.
Straight after the take, I can feel that this is a big fish, a really big fish. I'm filled with a mix of terror and delight, and 1,000 thoughts rush through my mind.
Han är rätt tung. Oj. Han är ju så stark.
When the trout rises for the first time, we were both surprised. This is a fine trout, in good condition. You can tell Ulf's nervous. This is his chance to land the first Danica trout of the season.
Den har lite prickar. är som att han inte gillar stenar. Tack.
When Johan nets the fish, I'm close to collapse. What a fish! It's just over 60 centimeters long and in great shape. We think it weighs about 3 kilos. This is some start of the season.
En gång om året. En gång i livet. Lille vän, sicken fisk. Ja, hej då. Fan vad häftigt. Åh. Oj.
Innan var det bara sådär.
On a further stretch of the river, we see another trout. This one looks more normal, and it feels like there's a good chance of landing it. I leave Ulf and sneak down to the water. The wind is still a factor, but at the same time it helps to conceal the cast. This part of the river is shallow, and the fish can be easily spooked.
While I light my victory cigar, Johan goes down to fish, and I just sit there, front row seat, and enjoy the moment.
Den kan ha slappat av här nere lite. Där va, kom igen. Snyggt. Ja, vänta lite nu Bosse.
Så ja. Busse så att det är en fisk som
Jag är arg på fisken. Jag kommer ner så där jag hovar då som jag lovade. Eller ska du hova han själv?
Det är knappt.
Hova den.
Det är sån här
hova. Vänta. Det är fantastisk öring.
fantastiskt vacker fisk.
As we're both interested in photography, it's just as much fun to be there with a camera and net, especially when you caught a fish.
Alltså det är helt underbart. Ja, visst är det läckert.
Well, I'm pleased with my catch. I'd been hoping for a really big trout too. It's a fine specimen, but anyway.
Den är stor.
From the woods, we can hear intensive feeding, so we decide to try for that fish. We move up through the woods, and after a few meters, we see a couple more rises. That's a really big fish. We are both keen, and we walk quietly upstream. Even if you are trying to be as quiet as possible, disturbing the fish is unavoidable. These trout have grown big because they are careful, and so they have survived for some years.
Even if we frightened off the big fish by the log, we never saw him again. It was still a fantastic day by the river. What a pity it was the only one this season. A huge storm blew in during the afternoon, and the strong winds, the cold and the rain put a stop to any fishing. During the following weeks the weather is changeable, and the mayflies never really get started. We'll just have to sit down at the kitchen table again with the maps and plan hopefully for the next season.
Det är 2,5 mil kör han.
After a long winter and a cold spring, the season is suddenly in full swing. Just to make sure I don't miss the start of the hatches, I go past the river every day after work. I saw the first mayflies a couple of days ago. Once you decided that tomorrow I'm taking the rod with me, you're filled with all sorts of elation. Your yearning turns into ritual, almost manic state of preparation. As Johan has a lot to do at work, I'm in charge of this year's Mayfly premiere. With a map from last year fresh in mind, I decide to check the lower part of the stretch. At the edge, next to the pollen, I can see a lot of mayflies on the surface. It's fascinating to follow a capsized mayfly on the surface of the water. The vibrating wings signal that this is the place for food. After some time, my wishes were granted and the shady water under the branches suddenly became turbulent. The trout is feeding more and more often, but it moves quickly over long distances between rises. At first I can't keep up, it's moving too fast, but I get there in the end. When the surface opens up under the fly, I have to hang on tight to slow down the fish as it pulls away.
Vilken fisk! Oj, oj. Kom till pappa. Kom till pappa. Oj.
It feels like a big fish, and like most of the larger trout we caught, it goes around in circles mainly. To avoid the trout becoming more stressed than necessary, I always use a shallow net to land a catch. I can't explain why, but the net itself seems to have a calming effect.
Oj, oj.
Even though the river hasn't really come to life, I wait a while to see what this evening's spinnerfall has to offer. Rises to dead mayflies is often slower and gentler than when they go for the newly hatched mayflies. It seems the trout knows he's got time on his side.
Show yourself.
And suddenly it happens again. I can't really explain it. The silence is broken somewhere on the periphery, and somewhere the surroundings are set in motion. When I eventually find a rising fish, I get really wound up. I'm just waiting to get in that final move, to place the fly just where I want to.
Oj, sicken här. Kom till pappa, vi får göra så här. Vi får mäta den hastigt. Nej, åh! Ja, det var en instant release.
Further upstream, a couple more fish are feeding close to the bank. I suppose I could tempt one of them as well, but I don't want to. Not tonight.
När kom det igång kläckningen? Even though we have kept in touch during the winter, there is still a lot to go through when we meet. The newly hatched mayflies are all over the river, but no matter how hard we look, we can't see any fish feeding yet.
Waiting at dusk at this time of year is really hard work. We both had a nap, 2 thermoses of coffee, and all the sandwiches before the sun is hidden by the dark pine forest behind us. And this is it. Will the trout be just as active tonight as they were yesterday evening?
The water is slowed down in front of the bridge by a deep pool. Suddenly a sixth sense tells me, stop, there are fish here. Even if it only takes 10 seconds for the fish to start feeding again, it feels like eternity.
It's clear from the start that this is a big trout. Small fish don't move with this sort of confidence. It's obvious who's in charge. But after a while, Johan discovers the trout's strategy and the roles are reversed.
It stays deep down near the bottom, so it takes some time before I realize how big this fish really is.
Hane. Vasset. Vi vill ha den stor. Grattis. Vilken fisk. Vänta så vi får se. Vilken. Ser längre. Ja, det är ju fantastiskt. Den är över 60. Det är helt sjukt.
The period before midsummer is fantastic. The Nordic summers are short and intensive. For a few weeks at the end of May and the beginning of June, you are treated to a cavalcade of new life. The strong scents and discreet sounds numb your senses in the end.
Late last night, I saw another couple of fish at the lower end of this stretch. They might be there tonight as well. Sometimes you do get lucky, and tonight was one of those times. At exactly the same spot as last night, there was a large trout feeding very close to the bank. When a trout takes a spinner, you can hear a faint, sobbing sound.
Han gick upp och han gjorde ett rakt. Jag såg att han la ner flugan en meter. Det är där vi får se. Och det var bara kom. Jag tror det är en fin. Ja, det ser jag. Nej, inte nu blir han arg. Stilträd.
Just sitting nearby and following the whole course of events can be as exciting as being behind the rod yourself. This fish is moving quickly, but it's fairly predictable, never straying far from its fixed path.
Om det nu blir läge att håna, det vet jag inte. Eller öring, Johan. Gud. Det är vilken fisk. Snälla fisken. Jag försöker. Det är långt kvar. Det här är en vacker fisk. Det är fantastiskt vacker. Jag backar upp. Jag försöker backa upp. Nu börjar han bli trött. Gå in där. Har du? Sticker ner. Vad väger den? 2,1. Vilken fet öring. Jättebra. Så har du flugan. Ja. Där. Så. Där. Vilken färdiga majsrik. Helt så. Vilken färdiga. Helt
The evening at the river whetted our appetites, but the next trip will go further west to a much bigger river.
Vilka himla fiskar! Var han var, för jag har inte sett vaket. Jag sätter mig här då.
Tidan Baltak outside Tidaholm is well known among fly fishers all over southern Sweden for its excellent rainbow fishing. But there's also a strain of wild trout that appears during the Danica period.
Dry fly fishing under a boiling hot midday sun feels strange. Normally, trout are shy and very difficult to tempt to the surface with a dry fly in these conditions. But during the Danica, the rules are broken and there's a good chance of catching a fish all day long. It didn't rise much, but I just felt that the rhythm of the water surface was disturbed, just a little bit. I knew exactly where the rises had been, so there was no doubt in my mind.
I was absolutely sure he wouldn't get that fish. But Ulf didn't give up and, well, what can you say? Victory goes to the stubborn.
This fish had for some reason decided that the mayfly was his. He quite calmly slid up onto it and almost contemptuously sucked down the fly.
The fish is big and it could quite easily be a rainbow that's taken the fly. And then we see the yellow side out there and suddenly things get serious. All I can think of is that I must get a picture of this fish.
I hadn't dared to think that it might be a trout. A trout this big in Tidan? Never! But it was a trout and suddenly I felt very lonely. It's all down to me and at the other end is the biggest trout in the world.
Titta på han, vilken öring! Tack! Vilken vacker fisk! Åh, vilken vacker fisk! Se, och vilka prickar! Oj! Oj, 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 oj!
When Johan lifted it out of the water, I thought I must be dreaming. A monster like that? Here?
Titta vad vacker han är. Kom och ta en nävbild på huvudet. Den är så stor. Jag håller han i vattnet här så länge. Den är så stor. Du kan sticka ut hur stor den är. Nej, det var lite. Så är det. Så är den. Du. Vilken öring. Tack för ordningen, grabbar. Vilken fisk. Vad stark han var.
During all the many years we have been fishing the Tidan, the really big trout haven't often established themselves in the quieter parts of the river. They prefer the faster waters such as this stretch downstream of the Bälteberga Bridge.
Åh!
The edge of the rapids on the other side is hardly ever fished, but today I'm absolutely sure there's a trout there.
I don't think I've ever felt so relaxed when fishing as I've done today. I'll never catch such a big trout in Tidan again. The peace and quiet ends. Johan is forcing his way through the faster water with a trout in his hook. It's probably used up most of its power in this first rush, and it will soon be ready to land.
When you believe in a theory and then see it work in practice, it feels as though you have come full circle. You have got proof that you have really thought through something.
Ulf. Fantastiskt vilken fin fisk. Ska du hjälpa mig att hålla den? Ja. Den är så himla stark. Absolut. Oj, jättevacker röd. Ja, otroligt. Jättevacker röd. Oj, oj. Grattis. Tack. Sicka flicka då. Oj, oj. Det var gott det. Ja. Kilofisk. Ja. Jättefantastiskt. Riktigt röd. Ja.
The main idea of dry fly fishing is to look for and observe rising fish along the river. So now it's time to move slowly upstream until we find a new fish. Bosse always comes along when we go fishing. He's become sort of a mascot, but he usually takes part in the fishing as much as anyone. If he sees feeding fish, he barks. The problem is that he also barks at cows, other dogs and squirrels, so he's not entirely to be trusted. You get a marvelous feeling of freedom just walking along the river, enjoying the fine weather and the beautiful countryside. Sometimes we sit down, waiting and watching. You get a feeling of tranquility and is lulled into a pleasant dreamlike state.
After a long day, we'll soon be in prime time, the last hectic round of the day's Danica fishing. Up among the treetops, you can see the hosts of mayflies competing for the females in a sort of rhythmic dance. On the surface, more and more laying females are appearing, and then, at the edge of the current below the bridge, the water starts boiling. About 100 meters downstream of Ulf, near the bank, a trout suddenly appears, and shortly afterwards the shiny waters are broken by another rise.
When the trout shoots up through the surface, I'm totally stunned. Trout in this sort of spot could be just about anything. I keep on thinking that I've just got to see this fish. It's been a fantastic day on Tidan, giving us a really large trout and a couple weighing in at over a kilo each. But all good things come to an end.
Titta, fick en till.
Oj! Oj! Den var fin. Va? Den var fin, Bosse.
Nothing gets your expectations up more than the prospect of the first day of the Danica season. It's early summer, and the promise of another fantastic day's fishing is in the air.
No matter how eager you are, there's still time to pause and enjoy the scents, the early summer greenery or a buzzard in the air over the river.
This is a really small river, so we split up. Bosse and Johan goes upstream a bit, and I turn off down towards the woods.
A lot of big fish are feeding. One is really big, but in a difficult spot where the river is overgrown and narrow. Even if it looks pretty hopeless, I feel obliged to give it a go. Getting caught up in trees and bushes when space is limited is a part of the fly fish's daily round. But after a while the fish is clearly disturbed and I get fed up with all the hassle. Time to move on.
After I get to the edge of the woods, I turn back upstream and have a really good look. There's always a risk of disturbing the fish, and even though I try to walk quietly, I still scare off a couple of them. As soon as I reach the river, I take the temperature, and it's perfect, despite the low water, just over 11 degrees. The sight of that big fish makes my heart beat faster. It looks really fine, and it's steadily rising. In the end, I decide to fish from the upstream side, even though there's always a greater risk of scaring the fish when you do that. There's not much space here, and I don't think I'll get a second chance. Must get it right first time. I roll out the fly as close to the fish as I can, and I feed out some loose line. Then I notice I'm holding my breath.
Ja!
For a time I think the fish has broken free under all the debris, but then I feel some strong pulls. It's still there, and my disappointment disappears.
Oj. Oj. Oj, oj, oj. En sån öring. Det är fantastiskt.
After releasing the trout into the cold water, I can only smile. What a marvelous start. What an absolutely beautiful fish. I don't need to make any more casts today. I'll walk up and see how Johan is doing.
I can see from a long way off that Ulf has caught a fish. He starts grinning as soon as he sees me. And now he wants to show me another fish just upstream that's feeding regularly.
I want to tell him about my fish, but I also want to show him the one I've just seen. It's a very active fish, and right now there are some mayflies over the water, so why not strike while the iron's hot?
Jag går upp här så.
Jag prövar en spinn.
Jag sätter mig här och väntar. Så sätter vi oss här och tittar på hussen. Kommer den. Här blir bra, Bosse.
When we look down between the trees, we can see how the fish is moving above the neck in a little pool.
As I try to creep into position, I can see the waves from the rise. The fish seems to move quite actively up in the neck.
At first I don't realize that Johan's fly has been taken by the fish, but then things get moving on the other side. I tied Bosse to a tree and hurried down with the camera to get a good picture.
I managed to turn the fish and I can feel that it's well hooked. What a strong fish! We see a few more rising trout, but we feel quite satisfied. We have had our fill for the day.
While the last egg-laying female stands over the water, we sit with our cigars and celebrate the success of this season's first day with the mayflies. Now it's time for the trip home and some planning for tomorrow's fishing.
Man kan ha det sämre det.
Betydligt.
Yesterday's fishing in that little river was really good, and we should perhaps give it another chance today. But a good friend phoned to tell us about his success in yet another river we haven't tried before. There are no limits to our curiosity, and this river has to be investigated. Unfortunately, we'd used up a lot of flies in the trees yesterday, so Johan sits in the car and ties a few more Danicas.
Sometimes, when we come to a new river, the urge to fish is greater than our desire to fish together. So, Ulf goes upstream while I try my luck downstream. Over the years, I have learned that spots, which are difficult to cast from, often hold fine fish. When you sneak along the bank and suddenly see a rise, it feels like the whole world is standing still. This trout is following a run along the other bank. The only thing separating me from the fish is a dense barrier of branches. But there is a little gap in among the branches. The likelihood that I can cast the fly through the gap is almost non-existent, but I have to try. What a luck! A successful cast, and the fly lands just a few meters in front of the fish. The head is almost terrifying as it breaks the surface. This is a very big trout, perhaps one of the biggest trout I ever caught on a dry fly. He's very aggressive at first, taking command at once. Strangely enough, it swims out from the bank and decides to fight it out in open water, where it hasn't got a chance. Catching such a big trout on a dry fly gives me a feeling of complete fulfillment. Even now, I know that I'm not going to catch such a fine trout again this season. This is my trout of the year.
Herregud vilken fisk. Det var det värsta jag sett. Helvete. Oj, oj, oj. Helt fantastiskt. Helt otroligt vilken fisk. Helt ljuvligt. Oj, 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 oj. Så. Nu är årets flugfiskesäsong räddad. Titta vilken fisk. Hur lång är den? Den måste ju vara. Hoppas att du blir lite klokare. Lite vettigare. Lite intressant. Där kommer den. Hej då. Yeah! Yes! Åh, vilken lycka. Fy fasiken vad underbart. Åh.
So it wasn't such a bad idea to try this river after all. But the evening is young and there are still spinners on the surface. The river is much quieter upstream. It is also lined with dense shrubbery. Deep water and protective vegetation make this an ideal stretch for large trout. And after waiting briefly, we can see cautious movement next to the bank upstream.
Jag kan inte göra någonting. Jag ser för det. Den är stor!
It might sound strange, but honestly I am relieved it's not me holding the rod now. Getting fly out and landing a fish here is really difficult.
When everything seems to be decided in advance, the fish is feeding and you're almost certain it's going to take, things can still go wrong. You're putting enormous pressure on yourself. I don't know quite what I expected. When I realize that the fish is on the hook, I get terrified. Trying to land the fish from this high bank just won't work. The only solution is, quite simply, to jump in.
Jag börjar gråta.
Vad är det för klass 8-spö? Få in den först.
Stanna ihop.
Suddenly the trout is in the net, big, fat and beautifully colored. I'm the happiest man in the world right now.
Tack. Tar du mitt spö så ska jag kravla mig upp i branschen.
Åh, vad gott. Du har inte något mer i den där lilla silverfärgade kalas-håret? It always feels a bit sad when the short but intensive Danica period comes to a close. It will be a whole year before next time. We decide to stay all evening so that we can get as much out of the day as possible.
The aim for this evening is clear. I want to take a photo of a good-sized trout in the dusk. However, the number of mayflies on the surface has gone down remarkably, so the chances of finding a feeding trout seem almost impossible.
I had almost given up the idea of catching another trout when we came up on a pool covered in green water lily leaves. Suddenly we saw a fish feeding on the dark, shady surface. I walked carefully over and followed the bank, hidden in the trees, while I tried to work out the fish's path.
It is quite incredible, really. Sometimes you can fish after a rising trout for hours without a take. I mean, Johan certainly has his share of luck, but this is just silly. The fish had hardly started feeding before it came up and took the fly.
Han är sjukt stor, Ulf. Åh herregud vilken fisk. Oj. Tack.
Even though the day is complete and the fishing perfect, I'm still curious about what the river has to offer further upstream. Perhaps there's that perfect quiet stretch among the rapids, or the neck of a pool, to be remembered for next year.
Once again we go our separate ways. Ulf wants to look at another stretch of the river, and I'm going slowly to the car. In the meadows, the dandelions have been transformed into grey puffballs. In the background you can hear the hay dryers working hard. It's over for this year. And then I hear that sound again, a gentle sob behind the bushes on the riverbank. I hardly have time to think before the fly is lying there, bobbing in the rings of water from the rise. When the trout comes up, I'm quite sure it's mine. This is one of those days when it's impossible to fail.
Oj, oj, oj. Och riset.
But if it's too easy, you can get reckless, lose your humility and respect for the trout. And that always leads to failure. The trout makes one last dash. The fly comes loose, and it's all over.
Här.
Du kan ha han din hund.
Kompisen.
Hej lille gubben. Va? Va? Var det borta?
Nej, tappade en. Ja,
Var det den vi hade här förut?
ja, det var
And now it's time to return to the daily grind. There's still the summer fishing, of course, and perhaps a trip up north, but on the way back to the car, we can't help talking about the next Danica season, because we're definitely coming back to the trout and the mayflies.